Hi, I'm Kirk Kernett.
I'm Ashley Gordon.
And this is Reading for the Rest of Us. This is a new show that we're producing through Troy University Television. And you named this show.
Actually, Ashley, there you go.
That's right.
That's what we're trying to
That's
do.
what we should have called it. Tell us what the title of this show means.
So, Reading for the Rest of Us. When we're talking about why we wanted to do the show and what its purpose would be, one of our primary objectives was to reach out to people who don't identify themselves as readers. We didn't want to have the show that people say, oh, yeah, well, that's not for me. I'm not really a reader. That's a show for people who are serious about books. And we wanted a show that would be for the people who maybe aren't so serious about books, because it's not to be a serious discussion. We want to talk about how books are part of our everyday lives and how they can be, heaven forbid, fun. So this is Reading for the Rest of Us. It's reading for everybody who doesn't already think of themselves as a reader, but since it is about books, if you are a reader, you should love it too.
Great. I'm a teacher and writer, and you are a writer, editor, publisher, and we've worked together for 5 or 6 years now on the Alabama Book Festival, and part of the reason we wanted to do this show was so the book festival could have a presence, I think, in Alabama throughout the year, rather than building up the couple months before we put it on. Let's start off just a little bit by talking about the festival and what the importance of it is. You were one of the founding members of the Alabama Book Festival. Tell us the story of how that got started.
Right, so one of those crazy people who thought Alabama needed a book festival. There were a handful of us. It started out as a storytelling festival, and we were lucky enough at that point to have the support of Catherine Tucker Wyndham, of course, whom we all greatly miss. And as the storytelling festival went on year after year, we just in our bones knew it needed to be more. So is it 7 years ago? We just had our 7th festival?
Started in 2006. That was the first one.
Right, and at Old Alabama Town on a beautiful spring day so far. We've been incredibly lucky with the weather, and it's an opportunity for all readers, again, both the ones who take themselves very seriously as readers and more casual readers, to come out and spend the day with books and with authors and with other readers, and bring their kids and have a barbecue sandwich and just experience, as my second grader said this year, the joy of reading.
Yeah, excellent, excellent. Yes, you know, it's a great experience to be out there. I've been out there both as an organizer and a participant and moderator, just about everything but emptying the trash can.
And author.
Well, yeah, and I'm sure I'll be doing anything else that anybody asks me. I feel very honored to be a part of it. It's usually mid-April, and we just finished one up like 2 months ago, so it feels like it's a far away. But be perfectly honest, I go through a little bit of withdrawal precisely for the reasons you're talking about, because I think those of us who deal with reading professionally sometimes forget how much fun it is. And I know I have to sometimes work very hard to relax and be able to read and just enjoy it, and not underline or not highlight or not try and think of themes or motifs or symbols that I might teach, but just to experience the language and the fun of turning the page. So this is a show that gives us a chance to do what we do off camera together all the time, which is talk about books and to promote the book festival. And we want to thank Troy University first off for giving us this opportunity, and our great crew for filming it for us. So let's get on with the show. For our inaugural debut show, we decided we are going to devote a half hour to one of our favorite mutual authors, who is
Jane Austen.
Jane Austen. When did you first read Jane Austen?
So there are two answers to that question.
Okay.
When do you first read Jane Austen, and when do you first read Jane Austen? So I, like many people, discovered Jane Austen in high school, and unfortunately it did not quite spark the love that was to come. So again, like many people, after the A&E miniseries of Pride and Prejudice, and Elizabeth Bennet who you immediately identify with as a young adult female, I thought, where have you been all my life? And promptly read Pride and Prejudice and then every other book by Jane Austen, and have found I'm not alone in my adoration. And now Pride and Prejudice is the book I read every year, at least once every year.
I actually brought my copy of Pride and Prejudice.
Your thumbed copy.
My well-thumbed copy of this. This is the first time I read it. I was a sophomore in college. I didn't do it in high school. I apparently was in basket weaving at the time. But 1985, Intro to Lit, or Intro to Fiction class. Professor's name was, believe it or not, it was a guy. His name was Kim Lovejoy. He got a little mad at me because I kept calling him Lovelace all the time. But I was really struck by the intricacy of Jane Austen's work. And I won't claim that I've been a huge fan throughout my career. I tend to cycle in and out, I think. But I do teach her fairly regularly, and have tried to teach a variety of her novels. But I am just really struck by the afterlife she enjoys as an author.
Absolutely amazing.
Tell us a little bit about it.
So, as I said, I came to read her after seeing that A&E miniseries of Pride and Prejudice. And then when you go looking for, there's so many ways to come to Jane Austen. Obviously, you can read the book, and if you're smart enough to get it that first time around, then good for you. But now there are multiple movies, both, she's kind of like Shakespeare in that regard, in that they're set in the time in which she set them, or there are many modern interpretations of them. Bridget Jones' Diary is one of them, where it sort of takes the story of Elizabeth Bennet and Darcy and transports it to a modern environment. So there are lots of movies that have been made, both being very very loyal to the story, and then more modern interpretations.
One I was thinking of, and I remember seeing this movie and then hearing it was based on a Jane Austen story and thinking, wow, I would never have gotten that if they hadn't told me. It was Clueless. Remember that movie?
Yeah, it's Emma.
Yeah, in the what was that, the mid-90s? But
and that movie created its own sort of fan base.
Right.
And so you can come at it through the movies. You can come at it from this sort of organic fan idea, where what we now have is fan fiction, which we thought, or at least I thought, from the publishing industry, grew up around social media. Where everybody can suddenly be a writer. You can blog, or you can be on a website. You can contribute. You can self-publish. You can take the story of Elizabeth and Darcy and add to it yourself. Well, in doing some research for our discussion, I discovered that the very first fan fiction novel was 1913.
Yeah.
So Jane Austen has been beloved, and not just beloved, but the idea that she has been owned. I mean, we really feel like she's a part of us, and her story is not other. It's not something vaulted and beyond us as individuals. She's ours, and we get to take that story and run with it, essentially.
What do you think the appeal is, in a nutshell?
You've asked me that before, and I've been thinking about it, and sort of for me personally, that first one was just Elizabeth Bennet, and what an amazing modern woman she is, with her intelligence and her quick wit. And then when you go back and read the books, and the older I get, as I read them, I see new things in them. There's such an amazing observation on society and relationships, and the dialogue is so smart and so quick. And I read recently that Virginia Woolf said that Middlemarch by George Eliot was Jane Austen for smart people. So I thought, okay, I'll give it a shot. And apparently I'm not smart people, because as much as I enjoyed Middlemarch, it didn't have any of the vivacity and there's a sheer joy to Austen's language and the exchanges of the characters that I've just not found in too many other authors.
I think one of the things that I love about her work is there's just a real acute sense of social observation.
Yeah.
I mean, she's often, all the eggheads like me, we usually classify her as a novelist of manners.
Right.
Which is to say that she's somebody who the drama of the novels tend to come out of issues of etiquette and propriety and what's right and what's wrong, the way we interact.
And stepping out.
Right.
I think, so to put a layman's term to what you're discussing, I think what maybe appeals about it is that in this incredibly ordered world, which is fairly safe, and in what we now perceive as an incredibly chaotic world of the unexpected and to some degree violent, a little scary, her world is very ordered and very
Right.
safe, much like cozy mysteries. You know, with Agatha Christie, you know you're going to get the murder in the end. And her world is in many ways ordered like that, but the conflict, the interest comes when the character steps out.
Right.
In a safe way. Nobody gets their head lopped off.
Yeah.
You know, but they step out and create excitement and chaos, and then the story becomes putting all of that back together.
Yeah, exactly. And I think one other thing that I think we really love about Austen is she's funny.
She's
I
funny.
mean, there is a very, you were talking about the modern elements of her. There is a wit and a sort of sarcasm. It's
Yeah.
not a.
It's not snark.
Right. Exactly. It's not snarky, but it is witty, and it sort of critiques the what's wrong in society. But it doesn't say, let's blow up the rules and
No.
let's have anarchy, let's have chaos, and everybody just do what you want.
But she does point out the ridiculous.
Right.
She is brilliant at identifying the ridiculous, but not necessarily acting in judgment. She's not harsh in her criticisms, but her characters that are ridiculous make themselves
Right.
so.
Right.
And so in some ways it's a gentle admonition.
Yeah. That's a great way of putting it. She looks upon sort of the more pompous, the buffoonery
Right.
of society, and the way that maybe people over rely on their social status to
completely
find
relied.
out what their identity is.
Yeah. Which people do now.
Yeah,
and I think,
exactly.
again, sort of drawing the correlation to Shakespeare, in you can take Clueless and sort of the same elements. You can take Bridget Jones' Diary and the same elements from Pride and Prejudice. People haven't really changed all that much. We're not wearing dresses down to our ankles unless it's a maxi dress.
Right.
In that case, we are. So many of the mores have changed. What's acceptable between men and women has changed, and obviously women have careers, and lots of things have changed. But at the heart of our personal relationships, we can still tell the story of, boy meets girl, boy sort of gets girl, boy loses girl, and then boy has to get her back.
Right.
And in our conversations, we're still having the same conversations that Elizabeth and Darcy were having.
That's an excellent way to put it.
It's universal in a sense, or timeless maybe.
Yeah. I'll give you another reason, and you kind of touch on it there. This stuff is romantic. There is a lot of romance, and I can say that as a man. I think there is a joy in these books that makes you want to love in a positive way. This is not a literature of what becomes in the 20th century a celebration of individualism.
No.
It is very much.
It takes a village.
Yeah, exactly.
It is a village.
And it celebrates, even as it critiques, it celebrates the bonds, the necessary bonds between people that we need to have a social system.
And yes, it's romantic. Yes, at the core of the stories, as Pride and Prejudice opens, a man with a good fortune is generally in want of a wife. So yes, the relationship between Elizabeth and Darcy is the heart of the story, and that's true for most of the other books, Emma and Mr. Knightley. But there are so many other bonds, friend to friend, mother to daughter, father to child, all of the human relationships. And as we said, the hierarchy sort of in the village, how we relate to each other, and do we do it positively and with honor? I mean, the story of Wickham and his dishonesty, she's very much talking about how we treat each other.
Yeah.
And isn't it better to treat each other well? So yes, love,
and in
but
a lot
in
of
all
ways,
of its senses.
why people love or even marry for the wrong reasons.
And what can happen
and
when
what
you
can,
do.
Exactly, exactly. Let's take a step back for a moment and just talk a little bit about her life and give folks who might not know some sort of background on her. Jane Austen was born in 1775, and she died at a very young age of 42. Died of what we today would call Addison's disease. It's interesting because I think there was a period of time where maybe critics were a little hard on her, saying that she had never sort of explored the world outside of her family or outside of the villages in which she lived
Which technically is true.
Lower England. It is very true, but you know, when I was a student, one of the common critiques of her was that she's writing in this Regency period, 1811 through, you know, she dies in 1817. But these are the era of the Napoleonic Wars, and there's all kinds of international chaos, and none of that is in the book.
Figures in. It doesn't even sort of blink.
Right.
You know, it makes no impact at all.
But to me, that's one of the more interesting things about the book. There have been a lot of attempts to sort of archaeologically dig under the surface to find those kinds of issues, and I certainly think you know, the emphasis on economics that are in a lot of the books, the ways that people define their status through money, has a lot to do with that social political background that's going on. But it also raises a question of, why do we expect writers to go beyond their immediate world? Why do they have to take on these grand cultural issues? Let's write about family. Let's write about
the everyday.
Intimacy, or the everyday.
Well, not to get gender politics into it,
Sure.
but she's writing about a woman's world and
Right.
a woman's perspective, which was the one that she held. And traditionally, the great writers are the men,
Yeah.
and they're writing about the things that are their preoccupations, which are war.
Right.
She was writing about the preoccupations, to be fair, of all of us, who we will love and who we'll spend the rest of our life with, and how we'll raise our children.
Right.
And so I guess to some degree, from a critical perspective, those could be considered small preoccupations. But to gird the earlier point that we were making, they are universal preoccupations.
The point I would want to stress as well is that Jane Austen is not chick lit. I mean, or that we shouldn't.
Assuming that you say that as a pejorative term.
Excellent. I'm glad you say that, because I do think I just said that as a pejorative term, and I shouldn't.
Should we define pejorative term?
A bad word. Bad word. I think, and I've had this conversation with male students, why men should read what we might stereotype as women-centered fiction. What can we get out of it? But the reality is, there's a lot of men in these books, and their behavior is readily identifiable, both in good and bad ways. And I think there are a lot of pleasures to be had in reading about the social interaction and the way that men conduct themselves when they're dealing both with families and with women.
Well, but your point earlier about how funny she is, her humor is not gender specific.
Right, right.
Everybody is fair game. And you can have a sense of humor and recognize the value of her writing, regardless of whether you come at it from a male perspective or a female perspective. It's excellent writing. It is incredibly crisp, pure representation of human relationships. Nobody gets shot.
Yeah.
You know, things don't blow up. But it's the part of every day that we all deal with.
Right.
So whether or not chick lit is good or bad, depending on your perspective, this does not squarely fall into that category.
Right,
I'd agree with you there.
Okay. One of the reasons we wanted to talk about Austen as well is because when you start talking about her, you're talking about an endless variety of books that she has inspired, really uncountable. And I think part of the fun of sort of studying her a little bit or looking into her is to see just how many different genres that her books and her writing are adaptable to. So we kind of split this up for today a little bit, and I'm going
sort of along gender lines now that you pointed out.
Well, it's interesting how that falls, isn't it? We'll try as the show progresses.
I get the zombies next time.
We'll try to break this down a little bit more. Actually, I started out with, I think, probably what might be considered a sort of female genre. I started with the advice guides. Jane Austen has inspired several
really?
Advice guides. Yeah, I'll give you a few titles. Just this year, Elizabeth Cantor, just a month ago, published something called The Jane Austen Guide to Happily Ever After.
Well, there you go.
And Laurie Smith has published The Jane Austen Guide to Life. And lest we think only women write about Jane Austen, William Dershowitz, not Dershowitz, but Dershowitz, published A Jane Austen Education, How 6 Novels Taught Me About Love, Friendship, and the Things That Really Matter Most. Now, I just sort of picked 3 out of an endless shelf of these, but sort of what's fascinating for me about these is the way that Jane Austen's work, whether simple sentences or relationships between characters or whole passages, become daily affirmations. I mean, it's really neat to see that her writing is used to, give guidance in a very practical way, and that's, I think that's neat. That's one of the most immediate ways that books, or dare we call it literature, has an impact on our lives. We may not recognize that we look for that sort of ethical advice. It can be dating advice.
We do. Yeah. I mean, I'm thinking of To Kill a Mockingbird.
Sure.
Which nobody in Alabama can grow up without coming in contact with, if not at least reading. And, one of the most widely read books all over the world. And it gives you a path to follow, and hers do as well. So we can be transported, but we can also have it bring us right back where we are. And it is a handbook for how to behave, should you choose to use it that way.
I love that, handbook. That's exactly the term I was looking for. You took probably the more obvious genre, at least for the one of them. And you have scoured tons and tons of, how do we classify these even? We wouldn't call these romance novels, I don't think, would we?
Well, some are.
Some are.
There absolutely is an entire, there's some publishers whose imprints seem to be nothing but romances written to continue the story, both of Jane Austen and other really popular writers like the Brontes.
Okay. So if I'm a Jane Austen fan, how do I find a good Jane Austen inspired, either a sequel or a rewrite? What ones would you recommend for me?
Well, the one thing that you can do is go online, because there are so many sites that are devoted to Jane Austen. Some of them are fan fiction sites where it's readers who have, it's amazing too, they go before the story took place. They fill in elements during the story, scenes that maybe didn't make it into her book, and then they pick up where it left off and do, days after the wedding to 20 years after the wedding. So searching some of those fan fiction sites, these are people who have absolutely scoured the universe for everything written by and about her. And whether you want the romance, there was one entire line of books where she pointed out that Jane, as you mentioned earlier, had a somewhat circumscribed existence and was never married. And so there were aspects to the book that presumably were unknown to her, to the relationships that were unknown to her. So this writer picked up where Jane left off, and this writer apparently was married. So they are, in some ways, there are many that continue that sort of coziness and order, and there are others that have looked for what was the real passion underneath that we missed. So there's something for everybody. And a whole mystery series based on Jane Austen, all of Jane Austen's books.
I think that's one of the neat ways that she has adapted is that that those stories are brought into genres you might not readily think about. I know you're a big P.D. James fan, and she
has my heart.
She just came out with a sort of Pride and Prejudice inspired novel. Tell us a little bit about it.
Okay. Well, I have it. See, I can do my Vanna bit here. So, P.D. James, who is an incredibly successful mystery writer, most people will know her Adam Dalgliesh character, is a huge Jane Austen fan and has been for apparently since she was quite young, like most of us. And so she's in her 80s. She has 8 or maybe pushing 90. She's 8 grandchildren. And so she took it upon herself to write a sequel to Pride and Prejudice that is also a murder mystery. And she did an amazing job of writing as herself, because I've read, I think, everything that she's written, but also capturing the voice of Jane Austen, that clipness, that precision, and the story is good. And one thing she did that most of these writers do is make Darcy explain. It's so many of them that I was reading through, they almost all do it, where we want to know why you were such a jerk.
Yeah.
And he justifies himself. So I think a lot of this is motivated by unsettled emotion. These fan fiction books, of which if this is one, it is sort of the ultimate. It's an opportunity to put those to rest.
Yeah.
So we get to poke Darcy and make him behave. It feels good.
There's a sort of notorious poking of these characters, and this was the other genre that I took on.
Yeah, this is yours.
This is actually a fascinating sort of genre that's come up. They call it the mashup, the literary mashup.
Right.
And I'm thinking in particular of Pride and Prejudice and Zombies, which came out about 3 years ago. And this is where you take the novels as Jane Austen wrote them.
Right, the actual text,
the actual
right?
text.
Okay.
But you stitch in zombie flesh-eating episodes, and it's
insane.
I will say this: it's a fun read. Followed by a couple sequels. There was Sense and Sensibility and Sea Monsters and Mansfield Park and Mummies. I will say this: they're fun and they're kind of novelty books. I don't know that they necessarily reward rereading in the way that I think P.D. James probably does. There's sometimes where I think maybe these books try to cash in a little too much on the notoriety of an author like Jane Austen. But that's not to say that they're not fun, and they're not kind of an interesting way that, as you said, in fan fiction, that we take these stories
and we own them.
Right,
and
exactly.
we feel the freedom to do with them what we will.
Right.
I think that's an incredibly important point to make for all of us as readers, and why we started the show in the first place.
Right.
This is not ivory tower talk.
Exactly.
They're not sacrosanct.
Yeah.
I mean, I adore Jane Austen, and I want to be able to read Pride and Prejudice in the words that she used, but I don't think it's something that somebody else can't play around with. And if they come to her through, if maybe their initial interest is zombies,
Mm-hmm.
or just the technological aspect of taking two distinct works and mushing them together and
Right.
seeing what happens, then that's wonderful for her to be found in that way.
Yeah.
However you come to reading is legit.
There are tons of people who have read Jane Austen because of Pride and Prejudice and Zombies that probably wouldn't have read
Never
her
would have found
before
her
that.
otherwise.
And that's always a
great.
great thing.
It's a great
We are out of time. That is our inaugural show.
That was great.
And I've had a blast talking about Jane Austen. So I want to thank Ashley for being part of this show, and I want to thank our crew here at Troy University. We will be back at some point in the future with another theme-related show. Until then, enjoy a good book.